Meta breakdown time! Welcome back, MTG Joe here. We are here for another weekly installment of the weekly meta breakdown where we look at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder. This particular video will cover the standard best of one meta for the week. And as always, we cover every format on Arena, best of one, best of three in terms of constructed. So if you're looking historic, alchemy, explore. If you're looking decks for metagame challenges, we did a big deep dive and played a bunch of cool decks this weekend. For the historic format, make sure to subscribe to the channel because we cover it every week. If you want a deck list on what's best performing deck on the ladder, we cover it every single week here on the channel. So as mentioned, we are looking standard best of one, and we're going to start off with looking at the popularity of decks, and then we will look in terms of the last week in terms of win rates. So a popular deck doesn't necessarily correlate to a high winning deck. So it is something to kind of keep in mind when you are playing through the games. You might see a deck a lot, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's played like it's winning a lot. People find pet decks, they might be wildcard constraints, whatever it may be. So something to keep in mind. So ignore the May 9th, it always kind of defaults to this, but the thing that we're looking at is Diamond to Mythic. And we're getting the data as always from Untapped GG, what we're looking at on the screen. Link is in the video description if you want to get started with Untapped GG, but I'll paste all the deck lists as well that we covered today. So in terms of popularity of decks, we have the three kind of mono decks that have been fairly popular for the last couple of weeks. And the reason the popularity is in part because they are fast decks, as well as, in the case of mono red, relatively cheap and easy to get into as a new player. So mono white humans came in at 12.8%, and then the mono red burn 12.7%, and the mono red aggro 12.6%. So fractional differences from week over week. The deck that's probably been the largest riser this week is we've seen a return to Selesnya Enchantments. We'll take a look at the deck itself, see what changed to have it come back up in terms of the meta popularity. We have mono black midrange, mono black control, pretty much the same deck, so that would really take us into about the 10 range, so that makes sense with mono black as the next popular. We see mono blue tempo at about 4%. This is a deck that's very cheap to build, but sometimes difficult to pilot. It is a kind of tempo deck that you have to kind of play on the stack, counter spells, stuff like that. And then the 5-color domain deck at 3.8%. So if we just kind of scan below, we can see the mono red deck was like 2 weeks ago at 17%. We see mono white kind of ebb and flow towards the top, being pushed around 15. So this is actually one of the flatter weeks where we have 3 or 4 decks in the like 10-ish to 12 range. But we can see Selesnya Enchantments. It was as low as 7.5. Yeah, so we saw like it was up, then fairly down, and we've seen it kind of rise back up the last couple of weeks into the double digits in terms of popularity. We see like mono blue kind of come down and slowly have a renaissance. And then we see the mono black mid-range deck slowly creep up. And this is kind of reflective of best of three as well, where mono black has had quite a big comeback after all the bans. People kind of moved away from it. No invoke, well, what are we supposed to play? But we see it kind of translate back there as well. I just want to add Esper Legends. It's relatively low just in terms of popularity. So yeah, like Legends deck is seeing like a fractional, like a % of the meta at best, kind of mixed into it. So we're going to jump into it. July 16th through to the 23rd, Diamond Mythic rank, 73,000 games of Magic the Gathering were played. So we are going to start off in mono red burn and mono red aggro. If we look at the percentages, 62.6, 62.4. So again, just like fractional differences between the actual decks in terms of win rates. So we're going to take a look at the burn deck first. The differentiation between these decks is typically whether or not they're on Mechanized Warfare or they're on the higher creature package. The Mechanized Warfare version typically will play some more burn spells, and it does have access to a one-sided sweeper in the form of End the Festivities. This helps in a lot of these creature aggro mirrors because it gives you a way to both proactively pressure your opponent while also sweeping their board. With the Mechanized Warfare, the End the Festivities scale. So each copy of Warfare lets your End the Festivities deal incrementally 1 more damage to each creature, which plays really nicely. Both decks will feature Kumano, Swiftspear, Phoenix Chick, Play with Fire. The burn version will also play Voldaren Aperture because it pings, and that ping also gets modified to have additional damage. And then a couple copies of Reckless Impulse for card advantage with the squeeze in there. Feldon for card advantage as well. 2 Sokuzens, 1 Mishra's Foundry in the mana base. This version, the curve's a little bit lower, so you typically see slightly less lands in this particular variant. From there, we'll jump over to Mono Red Aggro. So this version here, you'll notice 2 more lands because it is playing 4 of Thundering Raiju. So this version is a little bit higher on creatures. In addition to some of the cards we highlighted in the other deck, you also have access to Bloodthirsty Adversary, which lets you flashback spells. So because this also is effectively at times a 5-drop in this deck, 2 mana to cast, 3 to do the kind of ability, you are playing a larger number of lands in the deck. Instead of Voldaren Aperture, this version is also playing 3 copies of Strangle. This helps again in the creature mirrors. You have an additional 1 mana removal spell that can then scale and hit, 2, 3, 4 drops depending on what your opponent's playing. You could also hit Planeswalkers, which could be helpful in some matchups. The rest of the cards are pretty much the same on them. Just really depends on if the creature version usually has more sustained damage, where the burned version can do more burst damage, in the sense of, like with Warfare, you have access to more interaction, so you can typically play against more creature decks better that way. From there, we go to the most popular deck, which is Mono White Humans, and we've seen a return to the Knight Errant of Eos in this particular version. So this is kind of the core of the deck's the same each week, then we see slight variations. The Knight Errant of Eos allows you to have some card advantage. You're able to tap your creatures, and then based on the number of creatures that you're used to convoke Knight Errant, so this can get a reduced casting cost. You look at the top 6 cards, put creatures into your hand equal to the CMC of the tapped creatures, so you get some value there. It works really nice with things that have vigilance, since you can attack in and then tap it afterwards. So stuff like Adeline, the tokens can also fuel Knight Errant, Brutal Cathar's removal. This version is also on a couple copies of Ossification as additional removal in this deck. Then you have your human package like Coppercoat Vanguard pumps your team, Intrepid Adversary pumps your team, Thalia attacks, Sun Gold eats away at the graveyard and can get pseudo unblockable if you have Coven, protection from a color. Skrelv also could provide protection from a color to give you unblockable. Recruitment Officer for card advantage, and then Hopeful Initiate also can get larger in this particular deck. Then a deck that we haven't seen in a hot minute, it's been at least a few weeks that Selesnya Toxic has shown up, 60.5% this week. And it's pretty much the core we've seen more recently with these decks, and maybe it's just a return. Annex Sentry. A 1/4 body's not bad on its own, but this also provides like that Brutal Cathar style effect that allows you to exile a creature your opponent controls. So it gives you some removal in addition to the Soul Partition, which can also be used on your creatures for protection or your opponents. The Rot Priest can obviously be targeting and get you some value. So that puts counters and stuff like that on things like poison counters. Tyvar Stand for protection, Skrell for protection, Crawling Chorus gives you a body if it dies. Jawbone Duelist gets really nice with like additional pump effects because it could deal a lot of damage, but it's also just unblocked. It could put 2 poison counters. Skrell's Hives give you bodies, but also lifelink in these creature mirrors can help you swing the race. Slaughter Stinger's a Lord style effect on attack, and then Bloated Contaminator can push through damage and proliferate on those style effects. Seed Core to pump your guys, and then Myrex as well to make more tokens. We'll then go to Selesnya Enchantments, so 59.2% with a little bit more removal that we're seeing in some of these decks. The Hallowed Haunting plays pretty nice. Lets you, on cast trigger, get more spirit tokens that then could, if you have 7 or more enchantments, buff up your whole squad. Calyx is kind of the engine of the deck. Either lets you copy things or puts counters whenever you cast enchantments. Catilda gets big based on spirits, both with Hallowed Haunting, Generous Visitor's a spirit as well, as is Kami, but also enchantment. So this could be a lifelinker that helps you kind of get value there. The Restoration of Ajanjo is a way to kind of find some lands, as well as flip, get some value, also reanimate some of your key cards here. Audacity is a nice card with Calyx because it puts the trample through, and then you could copy Audacity. When a creature dies, you get to draw some cards. Skrell for protection, Jukai for cost reduction, Generous Visitor, and Kami of Transience can also help get things bigger by based on Kami itself gets bigger, Generous Visitor when you cast enchantments, Mashiko for pump, Ossification for removal, Spirited Companion for card draw, and then the Weaver of Harmony allows you to get some value in that respect in terms of doubling ETB style effects or triggers. We'll then go to mono black midrange, so 57%. So this is going to be kind of similar to the best of 3 version. For the most part, what they did is they swapped out the Invoke Despairs to Gix commands, provides a sweeper or lifelink or rebuy creatures. Sheoldreds are in here to gain you a bunch of life. Flesh Gorgers can be played as a 3-drop or 7-drop, another harder to kill creature that gains you life in terms of the aggressive matchups. Similar with Graveyard Trespasser, hard to kill creature that can gain you some life. Liliana Teed at the hand is force your opponent to sack creatures. 8 pieces of removal. Evolve Sleeper is a mana sink that can draw you cards, and then Underdog, recursive threat that can come out with haste, as well as draw you some cards, along with the Mishra's Foundries in the mana base. We'll then hop over to 5-color Domain, 56.7%. So this is a green-white based ramp deck. So you're using things like Topiary Stomper. This version's on a Souza Many Journeys to put additional lands into play, gain you some life. You have Invasion of Zendikar that can also find you lands. You have Sweepers in Sunfall. Ossification is removal. Archangel of Wrath is removal. Herd Migration can be channeled to gain you life and find you a basic and get you the Domain. And then late game can make you 5 3/3 tokens. By having a bunch of Triomes and just one of each basic, you're able to establish Domain. With Domain, you can get the Leyline Binding to flash in as removal for as little as 1 mana. So very flexible removal spell. And then your top end threats are Atraxas, as well as Atalis to just kind of go over the top of your opponent. Kind of mixed into there with the Myrex as kind of a backup plan. From there, Esper Legends, 56% win rate. And this has been fairly similar to the deck list that we've seen. It's not been as popular recently, but it's core of the Rafine deck. Draws you cards when you attack with multiple creatures. Through Connive, you're playing a Legends shell, so all the creatures are legendary, and that takes advantage of Plaza Heroes, as well as these channel lands, which get additional cost reduction, hence the 28 lands in a creature deck. Skrull for protection, Thalia for tax, Rona to draw discard, base whenever you cast legendaries, Go for the Throat as removal, Dennick for lifelink, and then kind of 2 bodies in 1. You can discard the extra copies of Dennick and then play it from your graveyard. Adeline for Go Wide, Lorna the Third Path, blow up artifacts or enchantments, Urtai as removal or counterspell, and then AO on the top end, and then obviously Sheoldred plays really nice with Rafine to gain you a bunch of life on each attack step. We then go to Gruul Aggro, which is pretty much mono red splash Samut aggro. So Samut cares about creatures entering the battlefield a turn that deal damage and draw you cards. So it's a kind of card advantage to the mono red shell. So a lot of similarities to the mono red shell that we saw earlier, the creature version with like Squeeze, Bloodthirsties, Feldins, also playing some copies of Yavimaya Iconoclast, and then Shivan Devastator is in the place of the Strangle. All the other cards are the same in this, but it's basically a mono red deck with a little bit more resiliency in the sense that you can draw some cards in this. You are sacrificing a bit in terms of the mana base, potentially could be a little more inconsistent, and then you get rid of Raiju in this version to play the Samuts instead. We then go to Boros Aggro, and this is close to the old Boros Aggro with like Luminarch Aspirant, the Boros like counters deck. So you have your Thundering Raijus, Kumano puts counters. The Dusk Legion Duelist draws cards whenever counters are put on it. So if like with Kumano it gets a counter, or with Thundering Raiju, or with Siege Veteran, all get counter style effect. There's kind of a soldier's sub-theme between Siege Veteran, Brutal Cathar, Dusk Legion's Duelist, Thalia kind of mixed into there. The Hopeful Initiate gets counters. So it's kind of a mashup of mono red and mono white humans. And then you have just like some protection effects mixed into there as well. And that one's at 55% win rate. Lastly, mono blue tempo, 53.6%. So this is a very budget-friendly deck. You are playing 4 rares in the entire deck. So you have just a bunch of cheap kind of cantrip style effects, and Consider, Thirst for Discovery, Flow of Knowledge, draws you a bunch of cards based on the number of islands. The core of the deck is to put a bunch of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. Hati Jin gets power based on that number of instants and sorceries, and also provides a cost reduction of 1 for each instant sorcery to cast, so it makes like all your cheap counter spells cost 1. Tolarian Terror costs 1 less for each instant sorcery in your graveyard, so it could basically become a 1-mana 5/5 with Ward 2. Bunch of cheap counters, Spell Pierce, Make Disappear, Essence Scatter, kind of mixed in, Fading Hope for bounce your stuff or your opponents, Slip out the back for protection, and then Impulse as a way to kind of find key pieces with your deck as well. So that's it for the week. Let me know what you think, what you've been playing. I haven't touched Standard in a hot minute. I've been all about Historic. I've been loving Historic, but let me know if this kind of represents what you're seeing in the meta. And like, I'm excited for Thrones of Eldraine, or whatever it's called, Wilds of Eldraine, just to get a mix up in the format. But as I mentioned from the beginning, if you do enjoy this type of content, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Free, easy, and helps the channel out. We are trying to hit 10,000 subs on the channel. You can see the bottom left-hand corner, we're at 9,438. So we're closing in, we're about 500 and change away. So any support you can, likes, comments, all go a long way. So greatly appreciate if you can. In any case, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great one and stay safe out there.